I have a question for you today. How many of you have been in this church for over 20 years? Let's see your hands. Okay, let me ask you this. How many of you have parents that brought you to this church? Raise your hand. Good number. How many of you have great grandparents that came to this church? What about great grandparents? Great grandparents? Ooh, we lost you on the 3 great grandparents. I was in a very historic church as the pastor on the East Coast. And in that church, we had a family that had great grandparents in the church. 10 generations of families and going strong. And Grandma Betty, who was and is the matriarch of that family, was our official church historian. Her family history was our church's history and vice versa. And so she would do great studies into the history of our church and inform us about who we are as God's people in that location on the East Coast. And I loved it when Grandma Betty would come to our Seekers and Joiners class where we inducted new members into our church because she would tell these new members that this church has been around for hundreds of years and we've been located in different locations. We've built different buildings. We've been called by different names. And we have had different ministries in different decades and different forms of worship. And we're just so glad to welcome you now into the fellowship so that you can help us to write history for the new generation. I love that kind of attitude because Grandma Betty was the kind of person that realized that life can only be looked at well backwards, but it has to only be lived forward, as Kierkegaard once said. She also, I think, reflected the kind of attitude that was there in the Family Circus cartoon several years ago. Did you see the one where it says, "Yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is God's gift." And that's why we call it the present. It's a gift. And that's very much the way that Betty looked at history in our church. Now, we are a historic church here in Redlands, meeting in this beautiful meeting house. And every week we are reminded of our history just in gathering together in this historic building. Also, we read the words of witness that are handed down to us from our Pilgrim Way. And the way that we structure ourselves as a congregation is as an independent congregation, kind of following in the footsteps of the Pilgrim forefathers who established this form of congregational ministry in New England years ago as they came as pilgrims and as separatists in that region. And then that form of government spread across the country as an expression in churches. And so we embrace our history here as well. We don't presently have a formal historian, and I am actually looking for one. So if you love history and would like to do that for our church, we'd love to have you in that role. Because I think that every organization, every church is blessed when they have a Grandma Betty, right? And I think we have a Grandma Betty in our Bible text for today because Paul plays the role of Grandma Betty. And some people think that Paul actually took a step away from his historical roots when he gave his loyalty to Jesus. But I'd like to take a minute just to clear up that, what I call a misconception that many people have. And it's a reasonable misconception that folks can have because we've read in Acts chapter 9 about Paul's conversion. And it's easy for us to think that Paul was converted from Judaism to Christianity. So he left his Jewishness and he became a Jesus follower, a Christian. And yet that is so far from Paul's understanding of himself or his understanding of what he responded to in his giving loyalty to Jesus. When Jesus confronted Paul, Paul began to embrace the fullest depths of his historical beliefs. He wasn't putting aside his Judaism, he was embracing his Judaism. And you see it in very distinctive ways in the sermon that he presents in Pisidian Antioch in the story that we had read for us today from Acts chapter 13. Here you have this first sermon of Paul's, much like the first sermon of Peter's on the day of Pentecost. It has many of the same formulas in it, same characteristics, same messages. And a couple things really point out Paul's great commitment to his history. One thing that he does is he recites for everybody in that synagogue, gathered as a congregation in that synagogue in Pisidian Antioch, he recites for them the historical narrative of God's people. And he talks about how God, the Creator, worked in a special way in his people in Egypt, that he brought these people out of bondage and into a promised land, that he gave these people judges and prophets and kings like David, and he gives David as an example. But did you notice how many times he said decay? I mean, it was not a mistake. He basically said, David's dead, folks. He decayed. And he doesn't quite describe King David like he describes Herod in the previous chapter, where he almost starts singing, "The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out." Remember that? But he does talk about David meeting in some ways the same fate. And yet the son of David, the descendant of David, Jesus, has seen no decay. And he has a message for all of us of God's love for all people everywhere. And that message is a message that he wants all people to hear. That's a message that God has been all about from the very beginning to the time of King David, to the time that he came in Jesus, and Jesus' Spirit is working in our lives even right now. And Paul wants the people to embrace that. Come to Jesus. Experience his love. Experience his forgiveness. Experience what this God of history is doing in a new way in you and me right now. And when Paul preaches, he also presents himself as a living example of the transformation that God can do. You know, many people will talk about, well, why did Saul become Paul? And you have to realize that names mean a big deal in the Bible times and among Jewish people. If you read a Russian novel, every character has how many different names? 10 or 11. Try to figure out who's who in Brothers Karamazov. I thought there were 3 or 4 brothers here. Now there's lots of different names. But people have lots of names, and they mean something among the people in Israel and in the tradition of the Hebrew people. Just like names mean something among cows. You know that's true, right? Haven't you ever had a pet cow? My papa on my dad's side, he had cows. But you know, they would name cows. I heard about a cow, a little baby cow, goes to the mother and says, "Mommy, why did you name me Daisy?" And she said, "Well, when you were born, a little daisy petal fell on your head. Named you Daisy." Another little cow goes to mother cow and says, "Mama, why did you name me Rose?" Well, when you were born, a rose petal came and fell on your head. Another cow comes and says to Mama Cow, why did you name me Lily? Well, when you were born, a lily petal came and fell on your head. And then the mother goes and looks at this one baby cow of hers, has a big lump on his head, and she says, come over here. We have to talk, Cinderblock. Dumb. But names have meaning, right? And in the Bible, names had significant meanings oftentimes because of events that occurred in people's life, particularly encounters that they had with God. For example, Abram, which means basically father, became Abraham, the father of multitudes. Jacob, heel grabber. Remember, he was grabbing the heel of his brother, and he was grabbing the heel of pretty much everybody after that. But this Jacob became who? Israel, which means wrestler with God. And then you have Peter in the New Testament. He was first Simon, which means one who hears, but Jesus wanted him to really hear and become the rock with his faith. And so he named him Petra. And upon this rock of your faith, I will build my church. And so names mean something in the Bible. And yet it's a little difficult for us to understand why Paul developed his name. But I think we have clues to it here in our text. At the beginning of chapter 13, it mentioned Saul, 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 Saul 4 times. But then it said, then he began to be known as Paul, and then he preaches this sermon. And he tells us the story of the first great king in Israel, whose name is what? Saul. And I suppose that this man who was given the name Saul could stand up before the people in this synagogue among this congregation and say, my name is Saul too. I'm related to royalty. But he began to be known as Paul, which means small or little one. Cindy had a grandfather, a paternal grandfather actually, was a small man. His name was Paul. He told me once he thought that his parents kind of cursed him with that name. Then he became Paul, small because of it. But it means small. And maybe what Paul was doing is he was taking on this name as a way of humbling himself, saying, no, I'm not that one. And you see even in the text of this sermon that he preaches in Pisidian Antioch, in the congregation there, in the synagogue, he says to them that there came a great man, John the Baptist, and this John the Baptist, even though he was great, he pointed to Jesus, who has not seen decay, whose spirit is still active and living today. And so he really sees himself like John the Baptist, who must become less, and Jesus must become more. And he's pointing to Jesus. Another reason why he might go by the name Paul instead of Saul is because here in this synagogue, his Jewish brethren had somehow began to deify history. Instead of having history inform who they would be today and how they would live in relationship with God in the present, the gift of God right now, people took history and made it almost a deity, solidified it and worshiped the past instead of being open to what God can do in the now. And so this Saul is rejected by these Jews who had deified history, and he said, I'm now going to the Gentiles. And you know what his name Saul meant in the language of the Gentiles? It meant mincing, or walking in a dainty, effeminate way. So he took on a name that would probably be more acceptable in the audiences where he was going to be presenting the gospel. So he was being informed by where he was going, even as he was fully embracing the past. He's really being like a Grandma Betty. And I just greatly appreciate how we have these rich histories that we can use, that God blesses us with. This church has some rich history. I mean, this was formed and established by leaders in this town of Redlands. And we've always had people who are leaders in our community and who are educated folks. There was a survey that was done before I came here as pastor, and our church has a large number of our members with academic degrees, bachelor's, master's, doctorates. And that's one of the kind of people we attract. And if you don't have that, you're probably very interested in a sermon that talks about the meaning of a Hebrew word because you are a thoughtful Christian that wants to understand. And one of the things that we have a tradition of is having a thoughtful, reflective faith. And we can continue to grow as a congregation as we embrace that. Another thing that I think we can embrace is our rich tradition of engagement with our community. This church stands at the heart of our city for a reason. We built our first building over on Terrace Avenue in church. But we go, oh, nope, we want to be in the heart of the city, not on the outskirts. We want to be right in the middle of town. And so they came and located it here after having built it there. And I think it was 1883, and they were there for 5 or 6 years and go, whoops, we're going to locate over here. Another thing about our congregation is we have a rich tradition of fine music. I mean, Julio and Victoria did such a fabulous showcase for us on Tuesday night. We filled up the chapel, and we have so many people with just wonderful gifts. And this morning, I thought our opening hymn about faith of our fathers, the God of our fathers, a wonderful way to reflect on our history as a church. But I thought it could have been improved because I learned something about Julio I wasn't tracking with. He was a major in trumpet in college, and then he moved to guitar and voice. But we need to have you play that sometime. Get your Amisher up, guy. But we have all these different gifts, and we'll continue to grow as we advance in some of these areas where God has gifted us. We want to embrace who we are, but we want to embrace who we are as we go into new ways where God is taking us. You know, I think a lady came to me after the first service. She said the final last words she just can't stand. She says, I don't like the words, we've never done it that way. Doesn't that drive you crazy? You know, there are some organizations, some churches, some places where you go and they say, we don't want to change, we're never going to change. If you want to be with us, you're not going to change anything. We're going to do everything just like it is. Before I went to my church in New Jersey, I visited another church on the East Coast, and they said, we're the kind of church that if you want the piano moved, you need to move it 1 inch a year. I don't think that church is in existence any longer because you stop growing, you stop changing, you stop developing, and you really start to die. You know, we embrace what God has done and what God did in Jesus, and we continue to embrace what Jesus does in us even now. Let's consider that as we go to God in prayer, shall we? Let us pray.